Hello, everybody. My name is Matt McComas, and I'm the Senior Program Manager at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for short-term rentals and the right to housing with David Wachsmuth and Stuart Schrader. David Wachsmuth is an associate professor in the School of Urban Planning at McGill, where he is the Canada Research Chair in Urban Governance. His research focuses on urban and regional governance, urban political economy, local economic development, urban entrepreneurialism and territorial competitiveness, and the politics of public space. Today, he's going to be joined by Stuart Schrader, who is a lecturer and assistant research scientist in the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins. He is also the associate director of the program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, which is co-sponsoring this event. Stuart is also a senior fellow at the 21st Century Cities Initiative, and he is the author of the recently published book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, which I highly recommend. Before I hand it off to Stuart and David to run today's show, I wanted to briefly highlight the agenda. So David is going to start off and give a 20 to 30 minute presentation, which is going to be followed by about a 20-minute discussion with Stuart. And then they're going to open it up to you, the audience, for questions for the remainder of the time. So during the presentation, feel free to put questions in the Q&A using the Q&A feature, and they'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. We're recording this event, and we'll make the recording available probably around sometime next week. So with that, I'm gonna hand things off to Stuart and David. Thanks.
Shall I take it away? All right, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to be here with you virtually. As Matt mentioned, my name is David Wachsmuth, and I'm from McGill University in the School of Urban Planning. And today I'm really happy to be sharing with you some research on short-term rentals from a housing perspective, from a housing justice perspective. At McGill, I direct the Urban Politics and Governance Research Group, where we look at pressing urban governance challenges from a kind of public interest perspective, and particularly challenges that cross or even call into question city boundaries. So for example, we look at the emerging threat of climate change to cities, and the fact that floods, storms, and other forms of climate risk don't pay any attention to the way that borders are drawn around our cities, but often those borders become quite consequential for how planners and other policymakers respond to these threats. One of the other major focuses of our work, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, is the way that economic globalization is transforming local housing markets around the world. And I'm particularly interested in this regard in the impact of short-term rentals. I've been leading for the last couple of years a project examining the connection between short-term rentals and local housing markets. And kind of on a broad level, we're trying to answer three sets of questions. So first of all, we're trying to just put some numbers to the issue of the housing impacts of short-term rentals. What impacts have they had on housing availability, affordability, and quality of life in cities around the world? You know, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that these impacts are pretty serious. If you listen to community groups, to elected officials, we've been trying to measure that so that we can get a better sense of what those impacts look like and kind of where they land. Second, we're really interested in the social dynamics, because if you think about it, short-term rentals represent the transformation of what is, for most people, you know, one of our most intimate spaces, like the home, into a market commodity. And we're really interested to see kind of, you know, to kind of follow the ripples of that transformation throughout urban life. And then lastly, we have a focus on policy options. So increasingly, local governments are taking up the challenge of regulating short-term rentals. And we want to help governments, community groups, and other kind of local stakeholders get their way towards the best possible regulations from a public interest perspective. So that's the kind of project as a whole. Today, what I want to talk to you about is specifically the connections between short-term rentals and housing, some of the previous work I've done on this, as well as some information about what things look like in Baltimore, and then also a bit about how the relationship between short-term rentals and housing has changed during the COVID pandemic. So before I get going, I want to say just maybe 30 seconds about the methodology underlying the rest of the presentation. This is kind of a talk all on its own, and I'm not going to give that talk today. So I'm just going to give you a very, very brief overview. The bottom line is that my team and I are working with a data set of every Airbnb and HomeAway or VRBO property in the entire world, and very detailed estimates of their activity every single day since about 2015. You kind of, when you do that math, it adds up to about 20 billion data points, and we add 15 or 20 million more every single day. And we also have the full text of every review that's ever been left on Airbnb, which is itself a pretty gigantic data set. Working with this size of data is exciting in its own regard, and poses all sorts of interesting challenges. Our focus has been on three things. We want to improve the spatial resolution of research into short-term rentals in order to be able to generate reliable measurements and estimates of what's happening at neighborhood and sub-neighborhood scales. We want to leverage the really detailed data that we have about each listing and what it's up to every day to generate new insights. And we want to raise the bar for the field by contributing open source code and software that other researchers working on short-term rentals can benefit from. And I don't want to go into all the messy details of how we do this, but I just want to give you a kind of a quick example of what I have in mind. So this map is taken from an article that was recently published in the Journal of the American Planning Association, which is the top academic journal in the field of urban planning. And it's about how planners should respond to Airbnb, and with a case study of Sydney, Australia. And it's, it's a nice map. It's got a bunch of dots, each of which is one Airbnb listing. But there's a kind of a, I don't want to say a problem with it, it's a fine map, but there's at least something maybe we could do better, which is that every dot on this map is the same as every other dot. But we know that's really not true. It's very possible that one of these points over here is actually an entire home that's rented 300 nights a year, and generates tens of thousands of dollars of revenue. And it's very possible that another one of these points was put up for rent one weekend 3 summers ago, was never rented, and the host never even bothered taking the listing down. So using the data that we have, we can, I think, do a bit better. So just to kind of give you kind of a fun example of the level of granularity we can approach, I put a dot here at Charles and 33rd, which is kind of roughly where we'd be if this talk were happening in person. And I've got a radius of about a mile. So going back to the happier times of the summer of 2019, this is a snapshot of all the Airbnb and VRBO reservations that day in the area. Every circle, the purple ones are entire home listings, the green ones are private rooms, the yellow ones are shared rooms. The bigger the circle, the more, the higher the price was. And we can actually look at this day to day and see kind of the, in a very fine-grained sense, where short-term rental activity is occurring in a given area. Now, obviously, this map itself, it's just, it's eye candy. But if you think about it, we can aggregate data to come up with really precise neighborhood level understandings of how short-term rental activity kind of touches the ground in different neighborhoods. So we've compiled a bunch of the work that we've been doing into a software package in the R programming language called STRR. That's short STR analysis in R. And to just give you one more kind of hint of the types of problems that we're trying to help solve, I've got here 4 short-term rental locations as reported by Airbnb. These are from Toronto in Canada. And one of the things we often want to do is we want to say, given the reported location of these listings, dots on the map, is it possible that they're all actually located in the same building? Because as it turns out, these are 4 listings operated by the same host. Airbnb shifts the location by up to 200 meters before it reports the locations, for privacy reasons. So what we can do is we can say, okay, these are the 4 possible areas where these specific listings are located. Could they all be located in a single spot? And using kind of standard spatial analysis tools, the answer is yes. We can see this yellow area where, that could be the location of a single building that all these listings were located in before Airbnb kind of shifted their locations. But often our data looks more like this. So this is about 100 listings, all operated by one host, and also in Toronto. And now if we want to know what the areas of overlap look like, the problem gets quite a bit more difficult. And actually, if we run this through standard GIS analysis software, this is what we get. We have an error. It's just the problem is just kind of too tricky to solve. But what we're really interested in is not so much every single possible overlap between these different listings, but rather what are the areas of kind of maximum overlap where the chances are good there could be a single building, that these listings are located in. And so our tool lets us identify in this case, that there are 3 potential areas where there could be high concentrations of short-term rental listings. So it's kind of a technical example, but the idea is meant to be that we're trying to work kind of at the edge of what's possible with spatial analysis of housing data and of short-term rental data. And this is one example of the kinds of tools we've had develop. So now I want to get into the substance of the presentation before we hopefully save a whole bunch of time for some Q&A in the second half. And I want to start by laying out from a theoretical perspective and then informed by some of my previous research in the area, the relationship between housing and short-term rentals. And for me, the kind of core starting point which is something that will, I think, be quite familiar to folks who work in the area of housing issues, is that the housing system, wherever you go, is kind of constituted by a fundamental tension, which is that housing is simultaneously a human need, a necessity for shelter, and a financial asset. And in different parts of the world, housing systems are organized in different ways based on the kind of combination of governmental policy and market forces. And so this tension can kind of, varies historically and geographically, but it's always there. I think the easiest way to think about this is that in the United States, for most families who are homeowners, which is most American families, their house is their largest financial asset. Right, so it's both a necessity and also an incredibly important component of the financial system, and that generates, some positive outcomes, but also some potentially negative outcomes. And in general, I think that it's kind of useful to think about housing market outcomes as being driven by a kind of combination of housing policy that the different levels of government set. From local zoning decisions through state level and federal level decisions about how to allocate subsidies for different forms of affordable housing, even transportation, a whole set of things that influence how the housing system works. But then also by the financial opportunities that are available in the housing system for market actors who are trying to take advantage of the second part up here, the fact that housing is a financial asset, and in fact, an incredibly important financial asset. So here's the key thing. Until recently, the only way to make money from owning residential property was to find a tenant. You could live in a house on your own or an apartment, but if you're trying to make money off of owning a residential property, you had to find a tenant. And that is no longer true, because as of the last 10 years or so, there's now a second way to make money off of owning residential property, which is short-term rentals. So the question that kind of launched my research in this area was, what happens if a gigantic new revenue stream is introduced into residential housing markets, which again, until about 10 years ago, there was just one thing you could do to make money off of residential property. So what happens when there's a second thing? And not just any old second thing, but one that represents actually quite a lot of money. So if we look at New York City, which is where I started doing this research, 2015, 2016, 2017, this is kind of the tail end of the big period of growth of Airbnb in New York. And we look at how much money Airbnb hosts earned in New York and compare that to the total amount of money flowing through rental housing markets, in the rental housing market in the city. So take all the rent payments that tenants pay every month to their landlords, and then you add in all the money that short-term rental guests pay to their short-term rental hosts. So that's the kind of sum total of residential rent payments flowing through the housing system in New York City. And you look at the share of that accounted for by Airbnb, and what you see is that it's pretty substantial. So it goes for the city as a whole, it goes from 1.2 to 1.8% between 2015 and 2017. And in Manhattan in particular, it's up more about 3% in 2017. So those numbers are reasonably big. But if you think about the fact that actually the total size of rental revenue doesn't actually change very quickly in most cities, including in New York, because most people, don't move, and their rents don't increase very much year to year. If we look at the amount of the change in the total volume of rents that Airbnb accounted for, it's actually pretty startling. From 2015 to 2016, 20% of all the new residential rent payments generated in New York City came through Airbnb, and in Manhattan it was 46%, almost half. So that's really a huge amount of money kind of newly flowing into the residential rental system through short-term rentals. And this is what a map of that looks like. So we got 2015 and 2017 when we started the study and when we wrapped it up, showing the percentage of the total residential rents accounted for by Airbnb activity. What we see is that it's pretty concentrated in lower Manhattan and northern Brooklyn. But in those areas, we're talking about in some cases 8% or more of all the money flowing into the rental housing market is flowing through Airbnb as of the end of 2017. Now, there's another way of looking at the impact of Airbnb on housing, on kind of housing revenue, and that's by comparing how much money Airbnb hosts earn by being Airbnb hosts in comparison with what they would earn if they were renting out to tenants on the long-term market. So that's what this map shows. What it shows is that it's a very different geography, right? So here we've got these gigantic concentrations of revenue in the kind of center of Manhattan and northern Brooklyn. And what we see by contrast is that it's kind of the peripheral areas of Harlem, the Lower East Side, and also Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, where if you operate an Airbnb reasonably consistently, you could earn 300%, 400%. Of kind of average rents on the short-term rental market, which is really a gigantic amount of money to be earned. When we combine these two patterns, what we found in New York was dynamics where we identified a set of areas where there was already a kind of high current impact of Airbnb on the housing market. And then a set of areas, that's what's in blue, and then a set of areas in red where there was a high risk of future impact because the earnings on Airbnb were so much higher than what you could earn on the long-term rental market. So those are the areas where we thought Airbnb was posing an active risk of gentrifying these areas, because if you look at the numbers as of 2015, 2016, 2017, it's pretty clear that more landlords ought to have been operating their units as short-term rentals if they were being economically rational, because there was so much more money to be earned. So that's what this map on the left shows. And on the right, we juxtapose that with the distribution of race in New York City. And we found a very, very striking pattern. What we found is that the areas where the kind of initial round of Airbnb activity were concentrated, which is blue on the map, were overwhelmingly white parts of New York City. Whereas the areas where Airbnb was in our opinion, was at risk of gentrifying and displacing existing tenants were overwhelmingly neighborhoods of color, in particular Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Bedford-Stuyvesant. Now we did this analysis in 2017, and unfortunately, I think it kind of came true in the sense of the areas that if we redid this map now, what we'd see is that there's been a massive amount of short-term rental led displacement of long-term tenants in those areas. So what we concluded from this work is that short-term rentals are like a really substantial vector for the financialization of residential property by offering a kind of a new way to earn money off of control of residential property. And therefore, we're kind of increasingly implicated in evictions, gentrification, and housing instability. So just to kind of be super clear about some of these underlying relationships, if we want to ask how short-term rentals interact with housing availability and affordability, the story is pretty simple. It's that short-term rentals, with a couple of exceptions, there are kind of some tree houses, and in New York, you can like rent a cab on Airbnb and camp out in the cab overnight. It's kind of weird. But generally speaking, what we're talking about are housing, apartments, right? And if the short-term rental is a full-time operation, it's taking housing off the market because either somebody used to live there or somebody, in any case, could live there if it weren't being an Airbnb. And if the short-term rentals are part-time, kind of what we think of as home sharing, even if they're not directly displacing a resident, they still are increasing the economic value of the house. So, if you're on the market looking to buy a home, and you see a house that has a secondary suite, which is pretty common in Montreal where I live, and you could rent that as an Airbnb. And that will supplement your income, allow you to afford a larger mortgage. And so you're willing to bid more for that house. And so even if I'm not interested in operating the Airbnb, if I'm looking to buy a home, I'm in competition with people who are interested. And what it means is that the existence of a short-term rental, of a kind of robust short-term rental market in the city is going to take housing directly off the market, and then it's going to raise prices even for housing which remains on the market. That's a kind of like a theoretical story here. And it's, going along with that story, it's also pretty clear who the winners and losers are. So leaving aside, the guests, like people who are traveling and coming to your city, if you think about it from the perspective of local residents, it's clear that the operators of short-term rentals benefit a lot, right? So people who are sharing their homes earn some side income. And then the commercial operators who have dedicated STRs, they earn a lot more than they would have from a long-term rental. So they're doing well. But then the losers are everybody else. So everybody pays more money for housing and has a harder time finding housing, the larger the short-term rental market is in a given city. Now, so of course, there's some other benefits that flow through, tourism spending, although of course, a lot of tourists would just stay in a hotel if they couldn't stay in a short-term rental. But if we look at it from the perspective of the housing market, the story is actually pretty simple. And empirical evidence backs that up. So there's been the major study of this that looked at 100 metro areas across the United States, found that a 1% increase in Airbnb listings in a zip code led to a 0.018% increase in rents and a 0.026% increase in house prices. So that sounds, those numbers may seem kind of low, but actually, during the period of time that they were doing the study, it wouldn't be uncommon for Airbnb, to be growing by double or even triple digit percentages year over year. And what they actually found is that in the period of time that they studied this, I think it's 2014 to 2017, Airbnb was responsible for 1/5 of all the rent increases in the entire United States. So 20% of all the increase in tenants' rents across the entire country can be attributed to the emergence of short-term rentals. So that's pretty striking. And we've done some research which hasn't been published yet, but I can just kind of share the very initial findings, where we attempted to understand what predicts positive or negative neighborhood sentiment towards short-term rentals by analyzing media coverage and using some kind of fancy geolocation. What we found was that it's not the number of short-term rentals. In fact, if there are a lot of short-term rentals in the neighborhood, on the whole, that predicts slightly positive sentiment among, in the community towards short-term rentals. Instead, it's housing vulnerability that was the key driver of negative sentiment towards short-term rentals. Neighborhoods that had a high number of commercial short-term rentals taking housing off the market, neighborhoods with unaffordable housing, with high numbers of renters who are a little, more vulnerable, and high numbers of newcomers, so kind of situations of more housing flux, all tended to be negatively disposed towards short-term rentals. So the bottom line is that communities, what we found is they don't object to short-term rentals per se, they object to short-term rentals making their housing situation worse. And the evidence is pretty clear that, in fact, short-term rentals have been making a lot of people's housing situation worse. So that's the kind of big picture story. And I want to now just share some number crunching that I've been doing about the situation in Baltimore. Starting with just a kind of my bread and butter graph of here's how many Airbnbs and VRBOs we've got in the city active every day. So this is not the number that you'll find on the website. This is the number that are actually kind of doing something where they're available for rent, they're being booked. And what we see is that over the course of 2015 through 2019, the number increased from about 300 to about 1,500. So a 5 times increase over the course of several years. It's pretty evenly split between entire homes, the kind of dark blue line, and private rooms, the light green line. That's pretty rare, actually. Most big cities have a much higher share of entire homes. Baltimore is a bit of an outlier here, that there's a lot more, a kind of much larger private room market for short-term rentals. Now, of course, the market collapses in 2020 and hasn't stopped collapsing yet. I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. Here's where these short-term rentals are located. These are all the listings that were active on any day in 2020. And if we look at them as a share of the total amount of housing, what we see is a very, very heavy concentration of short-term rentals downtown. So in most of the city, there is very little in the way of short-term rental activity. There are a couple listings here and there, but nowhere even approaching 1% of the housing. Whereas in the center part of the city, you've got 2, 3, 4% or more of all the housing, this is at the census tract scale, operating on a short-term rental platform. Now, what's interesting is to compare this pattern of short-term rental distribution with the pattern of racialization in Baltimore. What we see is that, so the map on the right here is the percentage of residents of each census tract, which declare themselves white only on the census. What we see is that there are very, very few short-term rentals located in areas that are overwhelmingly non-white. Okay, so these big sections of purple here are also big sections of purple here, but there are also very few short-term rentals located in areas which are overwhelmingly white, the kind of 80%. Instead, short-term rentals in Baltimore are concentrated in the, admittedly not, super extensive part of the city where that is a little less segregated, at least at the census tract scale. Now, I'm not an expert in the local geography, so I think it's something maybe we can kind of more trying to kind of contribute for a discussion. But similarly, if we compare the percentage of residents who declare white only on the census with by census tract with the number of short-term rentals per dwelling, we see that there's a reasonably strong positive correlation. So there are more short-term rentals in the whiter that the neighborhood gets, but in particular, it's this kind of middle zone where we see a kind of abnormally high concentration. We can look at the way short-term rentals are concentrated in other ways. This graph shows how much of the money is being earned by different hosts. What it shows is that the top 10% of hosts in Baltimore in 2019 earned 60% of all the money. So a vast amount of money is being earned by a very small number of hosts. And on the flip side, the bottom half of hosts are earning effectively no money. So we've got 1,500 short-term rentals active every day, but even among those, it's a pretty small share that are actually making a ton of money. They're concentrated spatially very narrowly, and they're also concentrated among a very small number of hosts. To wrap this up here, this is our estimate of the number of housing units that have been converted to full-time short-term rentals in Baltimore. The big block of yellow is entire home listings, and the purple ones are clusters of private room listings operating in a single apartment, which is pretty hard to detect, but we've come up with a way to do it. And what we see is that this number has been growing very, very, very steadily until basically right at the beginning of the pandemic. We had about 650 housing units have been removed from the long-term housing market in Baltimore. Again, if we look at the spatial concentration here, it's extremely narrow. We've got, most of the city effectively no full-time short-term rentals, and then in this area downtown, we've got 1 or 2 or more percent of all the housing. Okay, so lastly, just to kind of come back to some of the patterns we saw in New York and just see what they look like here in Baltimore. If we look at how much of all the rental payments in the city Airbnb accounts for, what we see is, again, in this area downtown, the number is quite high. It's more than 12%. Actually, of all the revenue flowing through the rental market is flowing through Airbnb. So again, we see this extremely concentrated pattern where in the neighborhoods where this activity is occurring, it's having a pretty large impact, whereas in most of the rest of the city, not so much. Then finally, if we look at the amount of money that frequently rented entire home listings earn, so these are the ones that are full-time or close to full-time, and we compare it with median rents, we see that throughout a pretty large area of the city, you earn substantially more by opting short-term rental. This, to me, is the kind of map of like where we should expect to see future short-term rental activity. Of course, right now that's going to be after the pandemic. We're still in the middle of a complete collapse of short-term rental demand. But what this indicates to me is that, so this is, by the way, this is 2019 figures before the pandemic, is that there are substantial chunks of Baltimore where, based on the evidence that we have from hosts who are operating there right now, suggests that there is a lot of money to be made. And that means that I think we should understand there to be a fair amount of risk of Airbnb and other short-term rental platforms kind of driving a process of gentrification and displacement. Okay, so I've got a couple things I can say about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the short-term rental market, but maybe I'll kind of save that for the discussion, since my guess is it's going to come up, and I can show you a couple more cool graphics at that point. So I think at this point I'll have a pause and we can move on to the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, David. Really, really fascinating stuff. And I really appreciated your focus on Baltimore. And I wanted to ask you just to kind of maybe extend some of what you've already said. One of the points that struck me, it's interesting that in Baltimore, and particularly at Johns Hopkins University, we have a kind of somewhat forgotten legacy here of critical geography. The scholar Neil Smith, whom I know has been influential on your work, got his PhD here. And one of Smith's, real contributions to critical geography is his discussion of uneven development. And when I came to Baltimore, I kind of understood why he was so interested in uneven development, because it's such a powerful lens for understanding the city. And of course, he also then extended his discussion of uneven development into thinking about gentrification. So I wonder if you could, talk a little bit more about how what you see in your initial foray into the data in Baltimore, how it corresponds or doesn't correspond. And you addressed this a little bit with reference to New York, but basically, are we seeing similar patterns of uneven development and gentrification through the lens of short-term rentals in Baltimore as we see in other cities, or is there something quite distinctive happening here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I would say at the outset, I think at a very high level, kind of, what I will kind of expect to see if I look at a given city, that I haven't done a bunch of research before, but, just what I know about short-term rentals in other places, is that if you think about it, it's very hard for local residents to compete dollar for dollar against tourists when it comes to accommodations, right? Because even if you're quite wealthy, relatively speaking, you're going to be willing to pay as much per night as somebody who's just kind of coming for the weekend is paying hotel rates or something like that. Which means that as soon as local residents are in competition with non-local visitors for housing, it's going to be hard for local residents to win. But the big question that leaves unanswered is where are the places where people want to come and visit? Because I think one of the things that the map of Baltimore shows very clearly is that most of the city, there's more or less no short-term rental activity happening, right? And that is simply a function of the fact that in most of the city there is very little in the way of tourist demand to visit and stay in those neighborhoods. I think, and I'm not sure if this went out to the general chat or just the panelists, but Christy Thornton mentioned that some of the hotspots look like they're nearby the sports stadiums, right? So in other words, the places which are going to be tourist draws, I think just at a first glance, we should expect those to be overwhelmingly the spots that are going to see the most short-term rental activity. And from my perspective, what makes this a kind of something worth digging into is that it's potentially a totally arbitrary relationship with the things which drive local demand for housing. In other words, the kinds of neighborhoods that people want to live and the kinds of neighborhoods that tourists want to visit, who knows what that Venn diagram looks like? It's very locally specific, right? And what the emergence of Airbnb is doing to cities is kind of sorting residential space in a much more rigorous way based on how appealing areas are to non-local visitors. So regardless of kind of local appeal, if the area has a lot of tourist demand, guess what? It's going to be transformed into effectively a kind of tourist zone. And so the fact that, in this kind of central census tract in Baltimore, you've got 12 or 15% of all the money flowing, in the rental market now is flowing through Airbnb. That's what's going on there, right? So in that sense, I think that the kind of generically speaking, the patterns in Baltimore are pretty consistent with what we've seen in a lot of other cities. What I think is kind of different and interesting, and I'm kind of when I'm comparing to New York, is that in New York, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the areas with the kind of highest level of vulnerability to having their housing markets kind of disrupted by short-term rentals were very clearly African-American youths. And I think that there are some kind of New York specific factors there around areas of the city which have cultural, extra local cultural legibility and appeal, right? So the question of whether or not, when you're thinking about, visiting New York, where you want to stay, Harlem's actually could be a really appealing destination. It's in a way that in other contexts where you've got kind of patterns of racial and economic segregation that can be quite strong, you don't see that. And I think that when I look at the data in Baltimore, that's what I see. Is you see that there's a kind of a stronger kind of influence, let's say, of kind of historical patterns of segregation on kind of being like channeled through current patterns of basically of tourist interest. So to me, that's a kind of a pretty big difference.
Right. Yeah. So Baltimore City, when we look at the map that you showed, the geography of where Airbnb is primarily located, corresponds to what we would understand as the white L, using Lawrence Brown's terminology. But what's so interesting about what you mentioned is that it's actually some of the most integrated neighborhoods in Baltimore where Airbnb is predominating. And there aren't that many integrated neighborhoods in Baltimore City. So it strikes me that this could actually be a driver of further resegregation, I guess would be the way to put it. Integrated neighborhoods where there is displacement occurring might effectively whiten them if this pattern holds in the future. And
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, so I think I think that's totally right. And I mean, if you look at the left-hand side here, the areas that are lighter in color are the areas where just at a basic level, the dollars and cents imply that there's a risk, there are opportunities for kicking out tenants and converting to Airbnb. That's where the people who've already done that are making a lot of money. So if you look at this kind of, this area here, that's kind of what you're talking about. So it's again, the terminology that Neil Smith kind of both made fun of, but then also used to some extent, of kind of thinking about gentrification occurring via frontiers of kind of capital moving through the city. I think that's one way you could think about this area here is a kind of frontier of Airbnb induced gentrification.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess what follows from this, and I think others on the call are certainly interested in this question, is given that tourism and travel, business travel, I mean, the first time I came to Baltimore, as an adult, was for a conference, and I stayed in an Airbnb. So this has clearly fallen off dramatically. I mean, you showed us some charts of how dramatically it's fallen off because of the pandemic. What do you think are the effects and going forward? Is this a temporary collapse? And also, if it's temporary, might it be different in a city like Baltimore as compared to a city like New York, which has millions of tourists flowing through it on a monthly basis, whereas Baltimore's rate of tourism is much lower?
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of really interesting things to unpack here. I mean, I think for me, fundamentally, the question of what is happening in the short-term rental market is a question of what opportunities there are to make money. I think, of course, there are some people who just enjoy being short-term rental hosts, but one of the things that we just I found just over and over again is that the amount of short-term rental activity that's actually home sharing, as we kind of traditionally understand it, has just been getting less and less and less and less and less and less over time. That to a pretty reasonable approximation, the short-term rental market is commercial short-term rental operators who are motivated by profit making opportunities. And again, we might disagree with the overall system that allows that to be viable, but given the rules of the game, it's kind of it's understandable behavior. So COVID has, I think it's not hard to see, has completely cut out the basis of making money off short-term rentals in cities. Now, it's not true outside of cities. In fact, it's the opposite. What we've found is that in kind of, in areas around big cities, but smaller town, rural areas, they've had a boom in short-term rental accommodation because people who've canceled their like long distance travel plans have instead rented a house in the country. So those areas actually are having now very severe struggles with housing issues because already they had a lot of short-term rental activity, but it's gone up and up and up. As far as kind of what's going to happen in Baltimore and other cities, so I'll just flip on a couple of slides that I had here. We've been doing something I'm very, very proud of. And so none of the results have been kind of like published in, tangible form yet, but I've been talking about it now. So this is, I'm going to share what will soon be public. When the pandemic started, I mean, mainly what I was doing was trying to look after my two kids who were suddenly home with me and like kind of finish the winter semester. But the only like piece of like actual kind of academic work I managed to pull off in that early pandemic was I said, you know what, I bet there are going to be tons of Airbnbs returning to the long-term rental market because short-term rental demand is going to collapse. I better try to track that. So since March of last year, I have been tracking long-term rental ads on Craigslist and on Kijiji, which is the kind of Canadian Craigslist. We got the Canadian version of everything, right? So I've been doing this in 3 Canadian cities: Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And I kind of wish I had done it elsewhere, but it was the pandemic. What can I say? And so what I managed to do was to write some software to match images. So we're seeing a pair of them here. On the left-hand side are 2 photos used to advertise Airbnb listings in Toronto. And on the right-hand side are 2 photos being used to advertise long-term rentals in Toronto on Craigslist. And obviously they're the same photo, right? So, I mean, there are some little differences. It kind of tells a lot of the story, remove the Airbnb Superhost badge before they moved it over. But the bottom line is that using the image recognition here, we've actually been able to track very, very rigorously, like, kind of with no uncertainty, the flood of short-term rental listings returning to the long-term rental market since the start of the pandemic. So this is what it looks like in Toronto. These are the number of these matches that we made every day, starting kind of in mid-March. And I think it's kind of a pattern that you won't find that surprising. There's a flood of them in March and April, and into May even, with the kind of initial panic, and it subsides a little bit, but never stops. And it doesn't literally has not stopped, because what's happened is the short-term rental market just hasn't recovered. In fact, we've done a bunch of estimates over this. I'm not going to put on a million graphs. There's got to be a limit. But in the cities we've looked at, we're talking about kind of like something in the order of like a 75% decline in short-term rental activity over 2020, and I think so. That's not going to last forever. But during this last year, what has happened is the business model has just evaporated, right? So one of the things that's occurred is that hosts are, again, because like they're motivated by money, that's like in a lot of cases we're talking about, these aren't like, gigantic conglomerates with 100 units. They're people who bought 1 or 2 condos, right? And they got mortgage payments to make. So they've returned these listings to the long-term market. And here have been the effects. Again, this is Toronto, but we've seen similar patterns in other places. If you look at the asking rents in Toronto on Craigslist during the pandemic, what has happened is they've declined by about 20%. Okay, so that's the red line here. Now the Airbnbs that are returning are charging much higher rents. I mean, these tend to be kind of high-end condos downtown is the kind of major typology, and this is the downtown area in particular. But what's happened, and they start off at very exuberant prices, which have themselves come down quite a bit. But the idea here is that we have seen actually, like in the case of Toronto, 3,500 matches of short-term rentals that switched over to the long-term rental market. And so we can see what happened to them. We can see how long, like what kinds of prices they're rented for, what happened to the listings on Airbnb, were they rented on Craigslist, etc. And what we found in brief is that something like 2/5 of the matches that we made have fully transitioned to the long-term rental market. So they deactivated the Airbnb account, the listing's gone. Another quarter or so have kind of suspended their Airbnb account. They've blocked their listings, but they haven't taken them down totally. So we think those are the ones that are kind of at risk of returning to the market when conditions recover. And then about 1/3 just didn't succeed in being rented on the long-term rental market, and so they're still active as short-term rentals. So when you put those patterns together, I think what we see is that there has been a really kind of like from the perspective of running a short-term rental operation, like a catastrophic collapse. And I think it's one that there's going to be a recovery, but it's not going to be a simple thing because there are a lot there. In the case of Toronto, you've got thousands of tenants who now have leases in units that just a few months ago were Airbnbs, and so leases end, and even if they're not supposed to end, landlords we know have ways of pressuring tenants to leave. But it really is I think like a pretty substantial shift. And the other thing that I would highlight, and so there's a question in the chat from Patrick Sisson, wondering about how these dynamics are going to change this summer, because travel, I think everybody's expecting there's going to be a travel boom, right? People are getting vaccines. I think that the first thing that's going to happen actually is maybe a little counterintuitively is that this isn't going to be a gigantic boom for short-term rentals in the way that maybe some of those hosts are expecting. The reason for this is that hotels are going to be extremely aggressive with price competition. If you operate a hotel, like you've got this huge building, you've got the property taxes, you've got the staff, like you've got all these fixed costs. So you'll cut prices to get bodies and beds, and they haven't been able to do so right now, right? Nobody's staying in hotels. But when travel picks up, they're going to cut those costs as much as possible, cut prices until they get their occupancy rates super high. For the short-term rentals, that doesn't work because you can always just put the thing back on the long-term market. And so what I think is going to happen is it's going to be a surprisingly long recovery, is my guess, or my educated guess. And that I think that the kind of flood of recovered tourism is going to flow through hotels first, and then eventually, back into short-term rental markets, when the pandemic is kind of far behind us. Now, just to wrap this up, my hope is that this is kind of buying everybody in the regulatory space some time to think about what the rules should look like, because part of what's happened is it's been a wild west where short-term rentals emerge with no regulations, no rules of any kind, and everybody's kind of playing catch up. This is a kind of like a year or two of take a deep breath. What should the system look like? And my hope is we kind of return to a period of robust demand with some better rules in place.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that kind of question. I think building on what a few folks have asked, Sharon, Claire, what are some of the kind of regulatory moves that local governments can make? What sort of where should community activist groups worried about gentrification, where should they put the pressure? Should they put it on local governments? Is there a way to really put pressure on Airbnb or just other companies that are active everywhere? Are there ways to unite across different obviously Airbnb, you showed us Sydney, you showed us New York City, you showed us Baltimore. I mean, could we imagine a kind of right to the city coalition across borders where there's a push against some of the vulnerability or the enhanced vulnerability that you're talking about? So what are some moves? What are some demands? What are some points of pressure?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, if I were to make a graph of my optimism or pessimism about this, I think I was initially optimistic. I got very pessimistic. Now I'm getting more optimistic. And so to kind of unpack that and kind of specifically where I think where some of these points of pressure are, if you go back 5 or 6 years to when Airbnb is first kind of coming into some conflict with regulators in Barcelona, in Berlin, in New York City, in Amsterdam, in London, in some of these big markets, what you see is overwhelmingly Airbnb is maximum intransigence. So they just refuse to negotiate. I mean, they ended up in court with the Attorney General of New York State for years, refusing subpoenas. It's very clear. I mean, the way that I would describe this back then is that if you're asking for cooperation with Airbnb, as long as your cooperation boils down to them collecting taxes, they're happy to do it. So if there's some kind of hotel tax, they'll collect the hotel tax, they'll pass it along. But as soon as the cooperation turns into somehow restricting activity on their platform or passing along any data about the actors on their platform, then it's like war. they would much rather go to court than comply with any of those kinds of demands. Now, I think some things changed in the years that followed. And, I think hopefully some of the research that I was doing was, part of the change here. But I think the bottom line is that it became harder and harder to deny that there was the need for regulations. I think that Airbnb's position of maximum conflict just became less and less tenable. So as of the last year or two, I think actually I think there's more hope than there ever was about actually pressuring Airbnb, the company, to make some moves here. But fundamentally, so despite, so I think there is a bit of optimism there, but fundamentally, their interests are just not aligned with the interests of local residents concerned about housing, and particularly concerned about housing for vulnerable folks. There's a version in a mirror universe of Airbnb that really focused on making it a really good platform for home sharing, and was really aggressive at following local rules and keeping the commercial operators from kind of taking over. But that's not we don't live in that reality. The reality we live in, they have gone all in on that for their business model. And I think that they will only make concessions to the extent that they are really pressured into making them. So I think, Stuart, you're kind of even just the thrust of your question, I think, is dead on, the sense of less about what Airbnb could do to make things better, and more about where are the forces of pressure. And from my mind, the story here is pretty simple. The story is governments have now demonstrated the ability to get some level of compliance from Airbnb and from Expedia that runs VRBO. But they prioritize this issue to the extent that residents and community groups make them prioritize it. And so that's why, one of the big studies we've been working on is understanding, what are the conditions under which residents put that pressure on. And I think it is I was initially wasn't sure if I would find it's kind of a NIMBY type story, where you've got neighborhoods with a lot of high levels of social capital who are just very defensively saying we don't want people coming in, or is it a story about housing vulnerability? And our research is finding that it's the latter, that it's, this is a story about people, that it's very similar in a lot to other housing movements, mobilizing to resist gentrification, to resist eviction, to kind of build tenant power in opposition to landlord power, those kind of familiar dynamics of how housing struggles happen, I think turn out to be very, very kind of compatible with the dynamics of the way that short-term rental markets are affecting housing. So that to me implies that the kind of solutions are going to look very similar. And, I think so that it's going to be, community pressure, kind of pushing on elected officials, kind of naming and shaming, some of the kind of private actors, the kind of combination of tactics that I think will add up to hopefully some successes. Mm-hmm. So there's a bit of comment here just about the, some of the rules, that there, Baltimore's got some rules in place now, and that in general is what's happened. I think basically most cities have some rules in place. To me, the big question is where the source of pressure comes to make sure that the municipalities put in the effort to enforce those rules and put the pressure in turn on Airbnb. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just kind of along these lines, Rachel asks a question which is about the ways that there might be kind of smaller regulatory rules that might affect us, and how does it map onto kind of racial geography. So the way I interpret this question is, for example, in New York City, rent stabilized leases, you're not supposed to do a short-term rental if you have a rent stabilized lease. Rent stabilized apartments tend to be concentrated, in certain parts of the city that might actually be the kind of, again, on the frontier of gentrification, or at least maybe the frontier 15 or 20 years ago. So, so is that enough? If it's hard to pass kind of citywide regulations, if it's virtually impossible to get Airbnb to, restrict its supply, is a building by building or a type of building regulation, is that an answer, or does that exacerbate some of these racial dynamics of displacement?
Yeah, I think I think it's kind of more the latter than the former, unfortunately. I mean, so the way I see this is that at the building level, like the building scale, there are a couple of patterns. So one pattern is if you have like condos and co-ops, like kind of shared ownership situations that have some level of like building level like governance, like cooperative governance. Those are like typically in the areas of in the parts of cities where there's a lot of Airbnb activity are now like gigantic battlegrounds over this issue. And we've done a lot of research with condo boards. And what we found is like just literally every single person we talked to basically had the same story, which is that people who are running Airbnbs out of their condos, they don't live there, right? Like they buy condo units and they operate them as Airbnbs. They just make so much money that they are totally unwilling to like voluntarily kind of give it up, even if the condo board decides that it's not permitted. And so these things end up in court, or in mediation or some form of kind of like they need to go through the legal system. And the problem is that the levels, like the kind of the apparatuses of governance, like condo boards, co-op boards, they just don't have the tools to like actually like govern for when there's this much money at stake, when they're good at things like figuring out about the building insurance and do we need to replace the roof and like trash, like those kinds of issues. But when it comes to like, I am making $100 grand a year with my Airbnb and you're going to tear it out of my cold dead hands, like they've had just a very hard time like actually governing those kinds of situations. But that to some extent, all that is kind of good news compared to the other situation, which is that it's the landlords themselves who are driving a lot of this activity. So, a pattern that we see a lot of is, like a tenant leaves and the new tenant does not arrive, right? Like instead the landlord is the one renting the unit on Airbnb, right? And, the kind of the standard pattern of rent evictions where, renovations uses a pretext to get tenants out and then it turns into an eviction. That has been kind of like that has intensified because Airbnb offers like such an easy way to make money that way. So that kind of building by building, what you see is a very, very uneven pattern where kind of existing like endowments of like social capital, capacity, privilege, et cetera, like translate into effectiveness at fighting this stuff, unfortunately. And so that's why I'm more kind of inspired and more like optimistic about kind of slightly upscaled, like, neighborhood level or city level, kind of like, more like kind of like social movement style approaches that say like, we're not, it's building by building, we kind of, everybody just gets picked off. Like what you need kind of collective action in that sense. So I think that's probably ultimately where it needs to go.
Yeah, and it strikes me that one of the arguments that Airbnb, et cetera, will make when there are pushes to change regulatory policy is that they'll say this is going to kind of harm the person or who's just renting out a room or whatever, who needs some spare money. And of course, what your research shows is that of course it's mostly these big commercial firms that are doing this renting and they're making tons of money on it. But I wonder, seeing like what Baltimore started to require in terms of licensing and fines and so forth, wouldn't big firms be more capable of dealing with those types of new regulatory requirements that municipal governments or whoever puts into place, in a way weirdly like support giving evidence for Airbnb's otherwise kind of spurious argument?
Yeah, it's great. It's a really good point. So, when I kind of released my first bit of research about this, which I think was in 2015, we looked at Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, the big 3 Canadian cities. And it was super simple. It was just kind of like crunching the numbers. But the big finding was this idea that 10% of hosts are earning a majority of the money. And so that, the newspaper headlines, that was the headline, right? And Airbnb's response to this was they said, this is misleading. The vast majority of our hosts are middle-class families, occasionally renting their homes to make ends meet. And my response was, right, exactly. We're saying the same thing. Like the vast majority of Airbnb hosts don't rent their houses much, and they don't make very much money off this and don't have a gigantic stake in this. You've got a small set of hosts who are making a ton of money. It's a business model they're really committed to. ever since then, my answer has been, like, my kind of general posture has been, we should take Airbnb at its word and focus regulations on encouraging home sharing. Things that allow for casual part-time home sharing, we should encourage. That's a good thing. I think it's like, I think I mentioned before that the empirical evidence suggests that even kind of the casual home sharing is like driving up rents and housing prices a bit. So that, that's too bad. Like, that's something to be reckoned with. But I think that on balance, like, I think it's a net positive for cities to have, I'm out of town, somebody stays in my place, somebody's shopping at local businesses, and like, activity is happening in cities. Like, cities thrive off that kind of activity, right? So promising regulations should do that, should do what, like, should kind of encourage short-term rentals to be like Airbnb kind of, has kind of rhetorically claimed that they are. What that means is, in very specific terms, and this gets to your point about, like, is it the large firms should be have the easiest chance of complying with kind of difficult rules, is just one simple rule. It's like, if it's your home, you can share it, and if it's not your home, you can't. Like, that's the kind of the state, like, the technical term for this is like a principal residence requirement. You're allowed, like, that you can get a short-term rental license for your principal residence. And, that doesn't solve the problem entirely, because, there are going to be some people who have a principal residence, but they travel 9 months a year. And the city's going to have a hard time distinguishing that case from somebody who just says that they're traveling 9 months a year and actually just live somewhere else. So it's not like, so it's not a silver bullet exactly, but as a kind of basic principle, I feel like it is the thing that both, like, lines up with Airbnb's own story about the company, and lines up with, I think, the best evidence we have about where the, like, negative and positive impacts of short-term rentals are, right? And also has the best chance of being enforced. So now, I'm not doing, like, I've been saying this for a while, but I think also, like, cities are doing this. Like, this is kind of, if you look at new regulations, like, what you see in places that are taking the issue seriously is that they're trying to do something like some kind of principal residence requirement. And that basically addresses your point there, Stuart, because what it means, so for example, in Quebec, where I live, the system is, if you live in the place, you want to rent, you go to the website, 3 clicks, $50, you're done. And if it's not your principal residence, it's a different process, and there's an inspection and a visit, and it's like a kind of a different world, right? But the idea is, like, make it easy if you're in that kind of default situation. I think that has, like, a reasonable chance of working, and will almost certainly allow us to do a better job, of kind of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Of having, like, the positive stuff of thing, which is considerable, and, like, certainly, like, traveling with, like, little kids, it's such a nightmare staying in hotels. I mean, I don't stay in Airbnbs now because I kind of feel like I'm conflict of interest, but, like, I wish I would like to, like, but so I think in a world where it's all home sharing and it's ethical, like, that I would love to live in that world, because it's a better, like, typology for a lot of people, and I don't think that that's impossible.
Yeah. So let's maybe answer these last 2 questions on the table that are quite interesting. So Gabriel asked, what kind of impact on short-term rental markets would you expect to see with changes in urban transit landscapes? Certainly, yesterday Amtrak, said that it's going to have all new train lines, but not to be facetious, like, it is certainly true that lots of cities post-pandemic are rethinking their use of cars and creating more access for bicycles, and hopefully public transit will follow from that. I mean, Baltimore as a city is notoriously plagued by a bad public transit system. This might contribute to, particularly if people want to come to Baltimore and go see the Orioles, they're not going to want to be reliant on public transit to do that, so they're going to stay very close to Camden Yards, right? So what do you think are the what's the relationship between transit and Airbnb more generally, and what might some changes in the kind of transit landscape as potentially more progressive policies start to come online, what might that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great. I'm glad, Gabriel. Thank you for asking this question, because I think it's a really interesting one. So first of all, in a city that has a metro system, if you look at the location of short-term rentals, you're basically looking at the map of the metro. So that's just kind of a general rule that, like, you have to squint, but I've made maps of a lot of cities, and, like, the ones that have a metro system, like, that's what you're looking at when you're looking at the map of short-term rental locations. And this is, I think, is totally intuitive. It's because if you think about people visiting, of course, like there's going to be a concentration of demand around where the hotels already are, because that's where hotels are where people have wanted to stay. You know, that's why they're there. But particularly in the more price conscious part of the market, if you can get downtown on the subway, that's kind of good enough. So what you see is, you know, prices decline as you get further away from downtown, but like very clearly the activity like follows the transit lines, right? And stops when the transit lines stop. So that's true even in New York, where like, if you get to the end of one of the subway lines, like you're like an hour or more away from, you know, like the financial district or Midtown or whatever, there's still Airbnb activity, like at the kind of end of the 7 train. It's obviously a lot less, but that's a pretty consistent pattern that we've seen basically everywhere we've looked. In a city like Baltimore that doesn't have like a big, you know, mass transit system, you don't see that kind of pattern. But so what that means, first of all, is that I think that as public transit evolves, like we would expect short-term rentals to evolve correspondingly, simply just because the demand is going to follow transit accessibility. What that also means is that, but this to me, like part of why I think this is such an interesting question is because this gets to this point I was making at the very beginning, which is that short-term rentals influence local housing markets and influence like this, you know, cityscapes, basically like in a way that is to some extent kind of almost like arbitrary from the perspective of like the drivers of local demand. So I was saying that about the idea that like tourists don't necessarily want to visit the same neighborhoods or stay in the same neighborhoods that are demanded by locals. Sometimes they do, and like there's some overlap, right? But that overlap is like, I don't want to say it's arbitrary, but it's like it's not like easily predictable. It's not one-to-one. And so I think the same kind of story is like the one that I would tell about like as like, you know, as a kind of like, you know, as transit landscapes change, I'm a little pessimistic about how enduring some of these changes will be after the pandemic, but certainly there's been a move towards like facilitating more active transportation, more kind of non-car transportation. Like those kinds of changes, to the extent that they're robust, are also going to kind of accidentally change areas which are viable from a short-term rental perspective. And so, you know, I think unfortunately we know that there's a kind of there's already a relationship between, you know, investments in local communities that had been previously disinvested in, like environmental improvements, bike lanes, those kinds of things, as kind of, you know, unfortunately kind of opening up the door to gentrification in some of those areas. This is going to be a similar phenomenon, right? So as better transit, you know, spreads, so too once we're back in the world where short-term rental demand is big again, so too will short-term rental demand. So you know, but again, like whereas for a lot of local residents, particularly in car-centric cities in the US, like the transit system is a nice thing, but most people's lives don't depend on it. You know, it's different in New York, obviously. You know, it's different where I live, but like you know, but for tourists, the transit system can be much more fundamental. Like you kind of need it. You know, for a lot of visits, which means that if anything, you know, I think visitors will continue to kind of price out locals in terms of like outbidding them for like access to good transit. I think is basically the pattern.
Yeah. So Castalia asked a question about Airbnb Experiences, which I don't know much about it. You know, I think it's part of the Airbnb kind of trying to change its business model a little bit. So maybe a more general question even could be like, you know, what are the other kind of dimensions of this business model? I mean, it seems like it's actually quite voracious in terms of trying to find new revenue streams, particularly in the context of the pandemic with the crisis that the end of tourism has wrought. So you know, what do you see these firms trying to do in terms of, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like the experiences idea, this is basically a kind of Groupon, if people remember that, like a kind of like, you know, local business kind of, you know, kind of tapping into local business. I mean, I think it's just to be like the kind of basic idea is very clearly that Airbnb is looking for opportunities to diversify, and particularly ones that feel like they can take advantage of like the market that they have. Like it's kind of basically 100% guaranteed to be people visiting a place and then like looking for stuff to do. And of course, you know, you have business travelers and their local parties, and it's not like 100% of their market, but it's pretty good odds. So it seems like a totally reasonable play. I think that the thing is that it does not benefit from what I think of as like the fundamental thing that makes Airbnb work, which is that you can charge more money for residential property by charging it to guests, to visitors, than you can to local residents. Like that is like, to me, just like the like gigantic towering fact that explains the short-term rental market. And so these like, experiences or any other kind of diversification efforts, like, I think just basically are going to be pretty minimal in terms of this big picture, unless they kind of interact at a similarly large scale with like, just the fundamentals of like the urban economy. I mean, like property is just so fundamental, and like Airbnb just happens to have kind of like hacked into this in a way that has like turned on a gigantic like, spigot of money. But so I think it's hard to kind of see that same kind of pattern in some of these other in some of these other efforts. The one I will draw you mentioned though is that Airbnb has actually been investing in residential development. I don't think that this has gone. I'm actually not sure about the current status of this. They had vast layoffs during the pandemic and kind of austerity, so it's possible this stuff was dropped. But certainly before the pandemic, they were kind of testing the waters with kind of like purpose-built residential developments that would be kind of like made for Airbnb, which like at some point you're kind of like, isn't that a hotel? Like it's, like kind of rates, but to me, that's the kind of more like intuitive like area for them to actually leverage the kind of the core thing about their market.
Right. Great. Yeah. So this question from Alessandro, which is super interesting, and I don't know if you've thought about, but he asks about the relationship between Airbnb and policing. How might we see policing adapting to the rise of short-term rentals in terms of what counts as crime, who counts as a resident, what counts as the community? I think this is a really fundamental question, and certainly in my classes, teaching the kind of fundamentals about policing, the broken windows argument really, in many ways, builds quite explicitly on Jane Jacobs' arguments about,
Sure.
Who has eyes on the street, who is a neighborhood regular, and who is an interloper, and that kind of determines decisions that police make in terms of responding to kind of community needs. And this opens up onto really complex and deep and important questions about class, racism, and so forth. And so I think this is, I don't know if you've thought about this, but I think it's a great question, to put on the table of how, because basically what you've suggested is just that Airbnb is interacting with so many of the dynamics that shape our built environments, our urban landscapes, our cityscapes, our the social experience of being in cities. So this is a crucial one.
Yeah, totally. It is something I've thought about. So I answer first by way of a kind of, a tangentially related anecdote here, which is one of the areas that one of the things that I've done some research on in the past is the transformation of downtown Vancouver, which is an area that is very, very poor. It has an extremely high level of drug use, and it's also been a pioneer in like safe injection sites. There's a whole story here. But on top of that, it's also an area with an extremely high level of privately run social housing, particularly for Chinese seniors. So there are a bunch of these. They're run by kind of like Chinese like benevolent societies, but you've got the Chinese community in Vancouver. This is Chinatown, and there are a whole lot of seniors living in rent protected housing where they're not at risk of being evicted or anything like that. Around them, their neighborhood is transforming dramatically. So you've got private rentals being torn down, fancy condos going up, a very like fast-paced gentrification story. And a story that I heard a lot was that you have these people who are like they literally cannot be evicted. Right? Like they're not at risk of displacement, but their experience of their neighborhood has transformed so dramatically. And that's because what used to be the Asian grocer is now like a fancy restaurant, but also because like the square where they used to play mahjong now has totally different eyes on the street, right? Like a different kind of like social context, and they feel like increasingly out of place. And I think that this is sometimes like I don't want to say it's like underappreciated, but I think it's like to some extent like the there are these kind of non-direct like displacement effects that happen when neighborhoods change, which really come down to the question of who feels like they belong, and then to get to the question, like specifically to the way that Alessandro phrased this, to like, you know, who counts as like belonging from the perspective of the cops. So actually one of the things that I have been talking about with a collaborator is like, we have a kind of a hypothesis that in New York, where you've got this, where for many, many years you had this terrible policy of stop and frisk, basically just arbitrary police stops of basically young men of color, like overwhelmingly, right? And this is the time when this was occurring happened to be the same time that Airbnb was exploding in New York. And it also happens to be the case that there's really good information about stop and frisk. Like every stop has been documented and like spatially located. So like our guess, which we've never actually haven't done the research, but we've talked about the idea, is that Airbnb activity probably predicts like risk of being stopped and frisked, basically. In other words, that like in areas where like the areas where basically you have like white tourists starting to show up, yeah, again, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's I think it's like a plausible story that those are areas where the police are going to become kind of more aggressive about kind of some of those kind of boundary questions in terms of who's in place, who's out of place, who like is allowed to kind of go about their business. I know, Stuart, you and I have talked about like the phenomenon of seeing white tourists with their rolling luggage coming up Malcolm X Boulevard in like that is like that's something which like I would be just shocked if that didn't have an impact along the lines of Alessandro asking about just not for any formal policy reasons, but just simply by kind of like changing intuitions of who belongs and who doesn't belong in these kinds of places. So it's something I would love to explore. And I really would be surprised if there wasn't a pretty strong story there.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that, and perhaps we and maybe we can get Alessandro in on this too. Maybe we should continue this conversation and do some more research about it, because it seems really crucial. Well, David, thank you so much for this. This has been a really fantastic conversation. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We really appreciate it. Thank you to 21st Century Cities for sponsoring this event, and also the program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship for co-sponsoring. I've put the links to both of our initiatives in the chat, so you can check it out. Obviously, as this pandemic semester winds down, we don't have too much more on tap, but we're hoping in the fall to return to a relatively regular roster of programming, just like this event today. So please stay tuned. Everybody who's attended, we will be posting the video, and so you'll be able to share it with your friends and loved ones soon. So again, thanks everybody, and stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.